Okay, so I've been kneading this now for about 10 minutes, and the dough has definitely changed in consistency. First off, I want to point out that it's still slightly tacky, not sticky, but there's a slight tackiness to it. But I also want to point out here, notice how, it still looks like there's a little bit maybe of lumps in here, but it's not. It's nice and smooth. There's no lumps of flour in here at all. Now, some people, you'll read somewhere that in order to know if you've kneaded your bread long enough or your dough long enough, you need to do what's called a window pane test. And that's where you take your dough and you stretch it out to see if you can get it thin enough so that you can basically see through it. And while that's useful, I find it somewhat challenging because people sometimes want to stretch it really fast and then all you're going to do is tear your dough. And so you have to be very gentle to do that. But honestly, as long as it's a nice soft texture, shouldn't be very stiff, nice, soft, and elasticy, you're good to go. Now, if you added a little too much flour, your dough is going to be a little bit stiffer. It's going to be a little bit harder to work with. It's not the end of the world. Still make the bread. It'll turn out great, just won't be the same as if the dough was a little bit less flour in it. But that's the joy of baking bread. You kind of just have to experiment and learn how to bake it and have it be exactly what you want it to be. So now we're going to have to let this sit again and do another rise. And before we do that, I have another bowl here. I like using plastic bowls like this. You can use square round ones, but I like doing this because it's easy to see how high it's raised. That's why on the first one it was really easy to see that it essentially kind of tripled. But what I want to do here is I want to prep it. I'm going to put a little bit of olive oil in here. Not a lot, just a little bit in the bottom. If I were to measure that, maybe a teaspoon, maybe even half a teaspoon, just a little bit in the bottom there. And then I'm just going to use my hand and grease the bowl with some olive oil. And this is just going to help it so that the dough doesn't stick to it when you're ready to move on to our next step of shaping it. Now, the other thing I like to do is make sure that get a thin coat of that olive oil on the dough as well. That helps prevent a skin from forming on the dough. And so you can see it's not got a lot on there, but it's got a little bit. And I'm actually going to, it's not necessary to do this, but I kind of like just gently patting it down in there so that it's kind of filling up the bottom. So again, by filling up the bottom, I can kind of see where it is, how high it is. And I'm looking for it to double in size at this point. And that should take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. And that honestly depends on how warm. It could even take an hour and a half, or maybe even 2 hours, depending on how warm your home is. And so we're going to, again, just go ahead and cover this. If you haven't used the olive oil, you might want to cover it with plastic wrap. But again, we're just going to cover it with a tea towel, set it aside, and let it alone for another 45 minutes to an hour and a half until it rises and is double in bulk. And then it's time to shape the bread.